Hi, you're listening to Joe Walsh in the Rainbow Project, and today I'm talking with the counselling manager, Martin Ralston, and we're going to be covering trauma. And the angle that we're coming from today is how to get the most out of your counselling session if you are suffering with trauma. Some of these questions are based on the work of Carolyn Spring. She is used to train counsellors. So if you're interested in looking up this further, you can look up Carolyn Spring and her work and maybe look at some of her books. Just a wee trigger warning, we may be covering some talk about physical abuse, sexual abuse, and rape. So just in case that may be something that is triggering for some people. So we're going to put this out as a video cast on live Facebook and a podcast. So welcome to all our viewers and or listeners if you're listening on the podcast. And I'd just like to say welcome to Martin Ralston. Martin, thank you for joining us today. We're going to talk a wee bit about trauma. And if you can start, Martin, by just telling us from a counsellor's point of view, counselling manager and trained counsellor of many years, working with the LGBT community, a wee bit about what is trauma and kind of how that might manifest for people, how they might know
Sure,
suffering from trauma.
sure. Well, first off, trauma is individual because it's a reaction. So as everyone's different, everyone's reaction to an event is different. So in a war situation, someone's reaction to a another part of the team being hurt or killed will be different from somebody else's. Somebody's reaction to a surprising event like a motor accident will be different to another's. There will be a small minority of people who will be able to put it into some sort of perspective and let it go and move on after a certain time. And there will be probably the majority of people which will have a longer term effect. The reaction people will generally know as a fight or flight response. And that is either a person reacts by anger and heightened adrenaline and goes towards the potential source of threat to dismantle it. They will go into fear mode, in which case they will freeze or they will flop, potentially play dead. And there's an oftentimes not very well known response called a friend response, which, if you're not going to fight it, you're not going to run away, you're not going to freeze. And maybe this happens with an aggressor, an actual other human being aggressor. A person can decide it's best to get close, keep your friends close, keep your enemies closer, and try and control and manage the aggressor from being close. So trauma is a reaction that is held over time because the reaction to the emergency produces hormones to get you to fight, run away, play dead, or move in towards a person, the aggressor, to dismantle them in some way. And then those hormones drain out of your body. You often feel tired and exhausted, and you go through a period of time where you put things into perspective and move on. But some people can't move on, and then they are sensitized to anything that resembles that trauma, or other people can't work it out and put those and process that. And so they go into long-term sensitivity. So the body in a trauma situation is producing those really strong hormones and chemicals in the body every time there's something that resembles that original threat.
So the body kind of has a memory of trauma and it stores it.
It has a memory of trauma in the brain, and some people talk about a trauma brain. I mean, the brain's the brain, And, some people will try and understand by talking about the reptilian brain, which is our sort of caveman brain almost, that is used to fight or flight. And, the cerebellum, which is the front part, which is the main processing part. Yes, there is certain things that happen around the hypothalamus, which is the bottom of the at the top of the spine, at the bottom of the brain stem. And it's where, after a trauma which is held and not properly processed, so the person doesn't move on then into a normal functioning, that becomes hypersensitive. And there's almost like a window where the alarm goes off for a normal threat. When the person's in trauma, that window will move sort of down or up, so that
it become more acute.
So much of a signal to kick that off. Now it takes a very small signal and it kicks that off, and the alarms go off, the hormones are produced, and we're going into a hypersensitive mode of functioning.
So people can be triggered by something that isn't very frightening to other people looking on, but because it has triggered their trauma, then they can have a very bad reaction to something simple like a noise or a bang or somebody coming up behind them and putting their hand on their shoulder.
Perhaps. Yes, very much. And, a typical thing in Belfast, especially with people of, above a certain age, people who were young adults and older adults during what we call the Troubles. Often when a car goes down the road and it backfires, you hear people go, "Oh my God."
Been there, done that.
And nearly had a heart attack.
Yep.
And that's, as you were saying, we might talk at a later stage about, like a community or a national trauma. That's a very sort of funny example of it. That we tend to be, our people of certain generations tend to be very sensitive to loud noises, because in the Troubles there were explosions, and in the Troubles there were gunfire and things like that. So, or the noise of groups of people shouting and yelling. So we're very sensitive to loud noises.
Yes, so we have lived through all of those years of the Troubles and 6 bends on EastEnders. That was quite traumatic time. Quite a lot to come through.
Yeah.
So somebody suffering with trauma, Martin, then trying to access counselling, the trauma in itself can be a barrier for them.
Yes, indeed.
Is there anything that might help get past that initial reaching out?
Well, there's something about acceptance of where you are. Often people will talk about themselves when they're talking about trauma, whether it is trauma from the Troubles, trouble from being a minority group, like lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, or people who of color talking about being a part of a minority group in a mainly white culture. People will talk about hypersensitiveness. As a counselor in our community, the LGBTQ plus community, people have said to me things like, I feel I'm almost porous, that people can see through me and they can see the inauthentic person underneath. So that's, for instance, with someone who is gay and who hasn't come out or has just come out, or, is working through that issue, and their self-esteem is compromised. They can often feel like someone, when they're feeling low, they can feel that someone is almost looking through. You can see this inauthentic person who's really not the same as everyone else. So that is why acceptance is a big step forward of, yes, this is who I am. This is my identity. I maybe do not feel 100% at ease with it, but I'm accepting that and I'm going to work on that. And I'm going to take that to counselling. Yes, I still feel that I'm a fraud, or I still feel that I am transparent, or I still feel low self esteem. But I'm going to try and work through that fear and make a positive step towards change. And the Rainbow Project, I know, will be supportive of my LGBTQ plus identity.
Excellent. And what sort of preparations do counsellors do before meeting a client? What sort of rules will go through your head? Like, I remember one example from Carolyn Spring's work. She said that counsellors would be trying to maintain a neutral facial expression so that they don't show judgment. And sometimes a person in trauma might interpret that as the counsellor doesn't care. So can you talk a wee bit about kind of the preparations the counsellors are
Yeah.
doing? Yeah.
Yes, of course. I mean, one of the things that happens in the Rainbow Project is a person comes for a health and well-being interview as the start of the process, and then will be given a counsellor from that. And in that situation, the client can learn a little bit about the organization, a little bit about the counselling service, and what to expect. So they feel a little bit more at ease. So already we're realizing that people coming with trauma, are very sensitive to being judged, are very sensitive about being rejected, because they have often been rejected a number of times in their lives. So we're trying to make them feel empowered by doing a health and well-being. The other side of the health and well-being is that the counsellor will get a little potted history of the client. And in that way, the counsellor before the first client appointment can sort of sit down, remember the potted history, and think, right, where is it likely that that client might feel afraid, or might feel oversensitive about being judged, or might feel ill at ease about actually just going from the house to the office, or being seen on a Zoom screen if it's online. So for instance, some clients will feel so sensitive about being maybe judged that they will only want to talk on the telephone, as opposed to be seen on Zoom, as opposed to then actually going out and getting a bus or walking or driving into the city centre and seeing a counsellor face to face. So the counsellor, through having that little potted history, will be able to adjust their approach to make that client feel as safe as possible.
Great. And the Zoom and the telephone counselling kind of came around through the pandemic and the restrictions. Can you see those continuing on as society opens up still as an option for counselling?
Yes, there are many variations in the future. Zoom and telephone counselling is always there, but Zoom really took on over the last year because of the pandemic. And on some levels, they suit people with, extremely low self-esteem. And actually, you can then move a client or at the same speed with the client from the telephone or Zoom, then to an occasional face-to-face counselling session, which will help their process of building their own self-esteem up. But for others, face-to-face is very important, and you can see the benefits of it. That part of healing from trauma is to be able to be yourself and to be relaxed with other human beings. So actually being with a counsellor in a one-to-one space, you're actually practicing that, because the counselor is a new person in your life, and you're role modeling how you can build trust, but still hold on to your own autonomy. And that's a life lesson. So you're still empowered, you're not giving your power away, but you are building up trust slowly with this other person to see if they are of benefit to you in understanding your trauma, and that you can accept each other and relate to each other with dignity and honesty. So all of that's playing out in a counselling session.
Quite a lot going on there.
Quite a lot going on, yeah.
Everyone's brain is packed with information, and yeah, it can be difficult to unload that, but the counsellors are aware of what clients are thinking usually. So as well as counselling, which is the talking therapy, Martin, there's other therapies available as well that are taken off. One in particular, emotional freedom techniques like tapping and things like that. Are you aware of any other types of therapy other than talking, or in addition to?
Yes, I am. I mean, as a counselor, I've also been a participant or client in therapy throughout my life, because counselors aren't immune to having problems. They're human beings. So I have done a little bit of combined arts therapies. I trained in that many years ago. And I've also been a client with an art therapist. I've done a little bit of movement therapy, and that was interesting too. And I've done a little bit of tapping, although I'd like to do much more. But basically, talking therapies is the most available, and it is a great start to coming to terms with your trauma, understanding your trauma, letting go of some of your trauma, and having more freedom in your life. But for people who have very complex trauma and multi-layered trauma, often that trauma can be locked. And we talk about the body has a wisdom of its own, and the body has a memory of its own. And a lot of people now will be familiar with terms such as muscle memory. And the idea is that, the impact of the trauma will actually be remembered as a resonance in the muscle cells of the body, or even the heart cells, which have been scientifically proven now to have memory, are in the gut, where the trauma often adversely affects the gut as well. And a lot of our health comes from a good digestive system. So one of the ways art therapy will work is you can be, and other therapies which can be put into a generalized play therapy category, is that you can often be doing something which is fun, and you can lose yourself, and you just sort of inadvertently express parts of yourself, parts of who you are, by painting a beautiful scenario. Or in the case of stand play, which is done in a sand pit, and you're working with toys, you create a scene. And then when you and the counsellor sit down, the counsellor will facilitate you in interpreting your own scene. And of course, that can be quite a deep interpretation, because often when you were just enjoying playing in this piece of therapy, you would have let out more than you would say when you were in a talking therapy, and you're a lot more guarded. Now, being guarded to some degree is not such a bad thing, because we're learning how to trust slowly and steadily. And, so it's not always a bad thing. So the play therapy, like art and sandpit therapy, and maybe we could put a little bit of drama therapy into that, and movement therapy. Because there's an enjoyment factor there, we can often express more than we think we are. So it's quite a powerful therapy. In movement therapy, sometimes people who are very experienced movement therapists can just tell by a person's body posture and movement where a trauma is being held, whether it's being held in the hips or it's being held in the shoulders, or even held in the face. So, and there will always be a certain degree of talking therapy in those therapies also. So it's, you're using art, drama, movement as something to express the trauma, but you need words and talking therapy to interpret it.
So yeah, it's always a combination of therapies.
Yeah.
Excellent. They sound really interesting, those other types of therapies, because they're maybe not as well known as counselling. But it feels like a journey. Counselling would be your first step to opening up, and then if there's still barriers there, you can then progress to other forms to help.
Yeah.
Are you aware of, we've talked about the troubles and that would have induced in the population collective trauma, and the recent pandemic and lockdown situations may have sustained collective trauma on the population. Can you foresee, as we come out of lockdown and the restrictions easing up, can you foresee that being a problem with the population coming out?
Yes, I mean, I think that recently one of the things I've been thinking is that in the UK, and I would say this is for most of Europe as well, people were talking about loneliness being the biggest pandemic before the coronavirus came along. And there's a number of things happening now in the UK because the UK is starting to come out of the pandemic. A lot of people are running, mainly younger people are running, out to the places that are now open to some degree or other and enjoying that freedom again. But there are a lot of people who were lonely anyway and then had to shield or just, got into the spirit of what they were asked to be doing and doing it. And their life has dramatically changed. There's a lot less in their life even than there was before. So their loneliness has really increased. And they're a little bit afraid of the stages of coming out as well and what that means. So I really do think if we get to a place where things have opened even a lot more, for instance, we can sit indoors in restaurants and bars as well as outdoors, and we can meet unlimited amounts of family members, that there's going to be grief, I think, for a lot of people. And because they will realize what they have been missing. Touch is one of our most significant senses, and a lot of people haven't really been touched much in the last year. So, if loneliness was epidemic before the coronavirus pandemic, then there's going to be loneliness and grief as we come out. And there's going to be all sorts of things because people who were a bit claustrophobic and indoors almost felt normal as everyone else was going indoors. Then they felt like they'd been left behind when people started coming outdoors, and they still felt like they had to be indoors, and where will they feel because they have gone through many changes of opening up and closing down. Some people, I think, will have lost what little self-esteem they had about coming outdoors and socializing. And I do think they will need support in making that step again and realizing that in everyday life, there always was a risk. You could be knocked down by a bus. There still is a risk. It's maybe just changed a bit.
Yeah. Yeah, there was a time when I thought I had been in for so long, locked in for so long, that I thought it felt more comfortable, the idea of just staying there compared to going back out again. And I thought I was going to have difficulties when the time came to come back into the office and things. So yeah, I totally get that it can be. So we just urge anyone who's listening or watching this to reach out and get in touch with us. We have a team of counsellors ready to help. We do have a bit of a waiting list, of course, because there are many people who have been in contact. But don't let that put you off. We also have listening ear service as well, and a number of other services to support. So that's about it for the trauma. Anything else you want to add, Martin, just before we wrap up?
Just to say, that we've been through a very difficult year and a half with the fear of getting sick and our health service not being available. And we've sort of come through that, and a lot of the rest of the world, though, is still going through that. We're beginning to open it up a little bit. And, maybe we all individually had different traumas and fears before we even entered that. So there's a lot of insecurity in the world, and a lot of people are feeling insecure. Don't feel embarrassed or ashamed of your insecurity. You are who you are, and you feel how you feel, and that's okay. And counselors and people who do support services will, like listening there, will understand that, and will be sensitive to that. And you're not being weird or strange. You genuinely have reason to feel how you feel.
Excellent. Martin, thank you so much for coming along today and doing this interview. We're going to put contact details for the organization. So if you want to get in touch with us, there's a number of ways that you can do that, and we'll post those in the comments. And we are also available for any questions. If this is raised for you, feel free to send them through on some of those methods of contact, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. So thanks everybody for joining us for this podcast and videocast, and we hope to be in touch with you soon.
Okay.